Welcome to Tales of Wild West. The sky was the color of cooled ashes when she rode into town, her bonnet pulled low against the grit that rode the wind. Main Street lay stretched before her, boards groaning under the boots of men who had no reason to hurry. The air smelled faintly of horse sweat and coal smoke, and somewhere, behind the mercantile, a hammer kept striking iron in a rhythm that felt older than the town itself. She kept her eyes ahead. In this place, people's stares were like burrs. They clung and scratched long after you passed. She tied her mare outside the general store, but it wasn't sugar or flour she'd come for. The noise reached her before the sight of it, a raw, jeering cheer, the kind that told her trouble was being treated as entertainment. She followed it to the courthouse steps, where a crowd had nodded together, hats tipped forward, eyes fixed on a small wooden platform. Atop it stood an auctioneer in a sweat-stained vest, his voice sharp as a whip. Beside him, 3 children waited, each with a burlap sack over their head, ropes cinched loosely at the neck, hands bound before them. The sacks were stained and frayed, breathing in and out with quick, shallow rhythm. They looked small, too small for the noise that swelled around them. 3 strong young ones, the auctioneer barked. 2 boys, 1 girl. No names, no trouble. Buy 'em cheap, work 'em hard. She felt her stomach turn. There were laws on paper that called such things unlawful, but here in the far edges of the West, paper burned quicker than kindling and worth about as much. She might have walked away. She had, once, years ago, when she was younger and the world had taught her to mind her own wounds. But 4 years of empty nights on her ranch had hollowed something in her, left her too quiet, too watchful. The smallest of the 3 shifted, a slight movement of head and shoulders. The auctioneer gave her a shove to stand still. The sack tipped just enough to reveal a chin and the curve of a trembling mouth. She heard it then, a sound soft enough to be missed if she'd been any farther away. Her name. Spoken like a memory. The dust swirled up between her and the platform. For a moment, she was standing in her own kitchen 4 years ago, humming as she cut bread for a little boy who would never grow to see the next spring. His voice had been small, too, when he'd last said her name. The ache she thought she'd learned to live with pressed hard against her ribs. She stepped forward without knowing she meant to. The crowd parted a little, curious, a few smirking at the sight of her, the widow who lived too far out to be neighborly, who still wore her ring though her husband's bones had long since gone to dust. "What's your price?" she asked. Her voice was low, but it carried. The auctioneer looked her over, a flicker of surprise cutting through his well-practiced sales grin. "For the lot?" "All of them." Murmurs rose like wind in dry grass. He named a figure that made her pulse catch. She thought of the small lockbox under her bed, of the silver coins that had taken years to gather. She thought of the silence of her house, of the way the walls seemed to listen for something that never came. "I'll pay it," she said. The auctioneer's grin sharpened, sensing both victory and the pleasure of spectacle. Coins changed hands. The rope bindings were cut, the sacks pulled free. The light hit their faces, and for a heartbeat, they all froze, the children blinking against the sun, the crowd leaning in for a better look. The older boy was maybe 12, his eyes a deep, guarded brown, his jaw set as if he'd decided long ago never to ask for anything again. The younger boy had hair the color of wheat at harvest, tangled and dusty, his gaze flitting everywhere at once. And the girl, the smallest, stared up at her. She was no more than 8, her cheeks hollow, her eyes the gray-green of storm water. There was no fear in her gaze, only a strange, searching patience, as though she had been waiting for the widow to arrive. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, some grinning at the foolishness they'd just witnessed. She ignored them, kneeling to the children's level. "You're coming with me now," she said, her voice softer than she expected. "You won't be sold again." The older boy gave no sign he believed her. The younger one looked from her to the street, calculating. The girl's expression didn't change, but her hand moved, small fingers slipping into the edge of the widow's skirt, holding there as if testing the strength of cloth. They walked together to her wagon. No one followed, but she felt the eyes on her back, the quiet judgment of people who'd already decided the end of this story. She helped them climb up, settling them on the worn boards with a blanket. The road out of town stretched wide and empty. The mare's hooves made a steady sound, the kind that could lull a body into forgetting the world's meanness. She didn't speak, not yet. There would be time for names, for truths. Half a mile out, she glanced back. The boys sat apart, knees drawn up, watching the passing sagebrush. The girl was still looking at her, as if the turn of the widow's head was all she'd been waiting for. "Why did you say my name?" she asked. The girl tilted her head, and for a moment, it seemed she might answer. But she only reached into the pocket of her ragged dress and pulled out something small, a button, weathered and dull, with a tiny flower etched into the middle. She held it out in her palm, silent. The widow took it. She knew it before she even turned it over, the match to the button she had sewn, years ago, onto a faded blue dress. A dress that had belonged to someone she had not thought of in a long time. The mare stumbled slightly on a loose stone, jolting them all. She tightened her grip on the reins, the wind sharp against her cheeks. The horizon ahead was a dark line, and for the first time in years, she felt the pull of it, not as an end, but as something just beginning. She glanced once more at the girl, who still hadn't looked away. And in that unblinking gaze, the widow understood something that made her breath catch. The girl hadn't found her by chance. She had been coming to her all along. The wagon rocked as the mare found her steady rhythm along the dirt road, the scent of dust and sage curling in the warm air. The children sat close to one another on the flat boards, the blanket pulled up to their knees. No one spoke. She could hear only the creak of wood, the clink of the bridle, the wind hissing low through the grass. Their silence was not the quiet of comfort but of braced hearts. The house came into view as the sun slipped low, a two-room structure of weathered pine, roof patched with tin, a narrow porch facing the endless spread of land. The barn leaned to one side like an old man who'd stopped caring about posture. She led the mare into the corral, then helped the children down. The younger boy darted his eyes everywhere at once, noting doors and fences. The older boy scanned the horizon, his jaw still set in suspicion. The girl stayed near, her small hand brushing against the hem of the widow's skirt as though tethering herself. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and bread long gone. She lit a lamp and set bread, beans, and milk on the table. They ate like people who expected the food to be taken away mid-bite, quickly, heads bent, hardly tasting. She watched their hands, the way they curled protectively around each crust of bread. When the plates were empty, she showed them to the narrow room at the back of the house. Two small beds sat against opposite walls. She placed the boys together in one, the girl in the other, though the girl only glanced at it and settled on the floor in the corner, knees drawn to her chest. She left them the lamplight and closed the door halfway. Alone in her own room, she sat on the edge of her bed, listening. For a long while, there was nothing. Then a faint rustling, the shift of small bodies adjusting to strange sheets. She thought of the button in her pocket, running her fingers over its worn petals. She didn't know what to do with it, or with the quiet presence of the girl who'd given it to her. At dawn, she found the older boy outside, standing by the chicken coop. The hinge on the gate had always sagged, now he was fixing it with a nail and a rock, his motions quick and sure. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "You know your way around a hinge," she said. He shrugged without looking at her. "Keeps the chickens in." She left him to it. By midday, the younger boy had vanished from her sight, only to reappear near the barn loft, watching swallows dip in and out. The girl stayed close as she went about chores, quiet but alert, as if memorizing every corner of the land. When they rode into town 3 days later for flour and salt, she felt the eyes before she saw them. People's glances followed her from the dry goods store to the feed supply. Some leaned close to whisper. One man, a farmer she knew by name, shook his head and muttered, "Mark my words, they'll bring trouble." She ignored him, but the words stayed with her. She'd lived under that same unspoken verdict since her husband died: trouble, in one form or another. The difference now was that the judgment wasn't hers alone to carry. That night, A cry tore through the dark. She was up and moving before she knew she'd risen. In the children's room, the middle boy thrashed in the bed, speaking fast in a language she didn't know, tears on his face. The older boy held his shoulders, murmuring something low, trying to wake him. She crouched at the bedside, laying a hand on the boy's arm. "It's all right," she said, though she knew words couldn't reach through whatever dream he was caught in. Slowly, his breathing eased. When his eyes opened, they flicked to hers only for a moment before darting away. Later, when the house was quiet again, she found the girl still curled in the corner, awake. The lamplight caught the sheen of her eyes. The widow sat down on the floor beside her. "Too strange a bed?" she asked softly. The girl didn't answer. But after a moment, she shifted closer until their shoulders touched, just barely. It was enough. Days passed, the rhythm of work wrapping itself around them like a rope, fences to mend, animals to feed, water to haul. Slowly, small changes settled in, the older boy speaking a few words more each day, the younger one daring to explore the creek, the girl sometimes humming under her breath. One evening, as the sky turned the color of bruised plums, she heard that humming again from the kitchen. She froze in the doorway. The girl sat on a stool, tracing a finger over the table's worn grooves, her voice weaving a tune the widow knew down to her bones, the lullaby she'd sung to her own child, long ago. She stepped inside, her throat tight. "Where did you learn that song?" The girl looked up, startled, and for a moment said nothing. Then she returned to her tracing, voice falling silent. The widow didn't press. Instead, she poured 2 cups of warm milk, sliding one toward the girl, who wrapped her hands around it as though guarding a rare treasure. They drank in silence, the space between them thick with the unasked. When the girl finally spoke, her voice was barely more than breath. "Mama used to sing it." The widow set her cup down, her hands steady only by effort. "Your mother knew me?" The girl's eyes lifted, holding hers in that unblinking way she had. "She said, if I ever found you, I'd be safe." The widow swallowed against the tightness in her chest. She wanted to ask a dozen questions, how her mother had known her, where she'd gone, why the girl had been at the auction, but the stillness between them felt fragile, like the skin of cooling milk. Outside, the last light faded from the sky. The widow reached into her apron pocket and touched the button again, its metal cool against her skin. From somewhere beyond the porch, a horse whinnied. Not her mare. This sound was lower, unfamiliar, carrying across the land with the weight of approach. The girl's fingers tightened around the cup. The widow turned toward the sound, her heartbeat quickening, the air inside the little house shifting as though it knew change was on the way. Rain swept in before dawn, soft at first, then hard enough to drum against the roof like impatient fingers. The smell of wet sage drifted through the open window, and for the first time since they'd arrived, the children slept past sunrise. She let them. The land could wait a day. By mid-morning, the clouds had thinned, leaving the earth dark and glistening. Puddles gathered in the ruts of the yard, each holding a trembling scrap of sky. She found the older boy stacking firewood without being asked, the younger chasing chickens with a stick, his laughter startling in its unguardedness. The girl stood near the porch, watching them both, her bare feet damp in the grass. When the younger boy slipped on the wet boards and landed in a shallow puddle, water splashing up to his ears, the girl's laughter joined his, light and sudden. The sound caught the widow unprepared. It had the same effect as the first break of sun after a long storm. You didn't realize how much you'd missed it until it was there again. That night, when the fire was low and the children had drifted into the slow breathing of sleep, she sat with the girl at the table. The button lay between them, dull in the lamplight. "I need to know," she said softly. "Why did you know my name that day?" The girl's gaze stayed on the button. Her small fingers touched it once, like testing if it would still be there, then she began to speak. Her mother had worked for the widow's family before the war. She remembered only pieces, a warm kitchen, the smell of baking bread, a kind laugh. When the war came, they had left for another town. Years later, her mother told her, "If you ever lose me, find the widow. She will keep you." The widow listened, her chest aching at the thought of being someone's last hope without even knowing it. "And your mother?" she asked. The girl's voice thinned to almost nothing. "She's gone." The widow reached across the table, resting her hand over the girl's. The girl didn't pull away. In the days that followed, something in the house shifted. The boys began helping with chores unprompted, mending fences, carrying water. The younger boy began to whistle when he worked. The girl started sleeping in her bed instead of the corner, though she still kept the blanket tucked high around her. When the spring fair came to town, the widow decided they would all go. She wanted the children to see something other than the ranch and the rough edges of the auction block that still clung to their memories. The fair was small, a few wagons of goods, a pen of sheep for judging, tables with pies that smelled of cinnamon. The children stayed close, eyes wide at the noise and color. The younger boy tugged at her sleeve, pointing to a stall of wooden toys. She bought him a small carved horse, watching his face light in a way that made the coins worth more than gold. They ate fried dough under a canvas awning while rain threatened again in the distance. For a while, she forgot about the wary glances from townsfolk, the murmurs behind hands. The children were laughing, and that was enough. But as they left, walking back toward the wagon, she saw him. A man stood across the street, tall, lean, dressed in a black hat pulled low. He leaned against the hitching rail, arms folded, eyes fixed on her and the children. There was no mistaking the intent in his stare, not curiosity, but possession. Her steps slowed. The girl felt it too. Her hands slipped into the widow's without looking up. The man's gaze moved over the children one by one, lingering on the girl. Then he touched the brim of his hat and smiled, a thin, humorless curve, before turning away. The ride home was quiet. The mare's hooves struck the road in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The widow kept glancing back, half expecting to see a dust trail behind them, but the horizon stayed empty. That evening, while the boys fed the chickens, she asked the girl in a low voice if she knew the man. The girl hesitated, then shook her head, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something like recognition. After supper, the older boy pulled her aside. "He was at one of the places they kept us," he said. "Didn't buy us, but he talked to the man who did." His voice carried the weight of remembering too much. The widow felt the old, familiar tightness in her chest, the one that had gripped her at the auction. This man had seen them before, had reason to believe they belonged somewhere else, and might not care who they had become in the meantime. That night, the wind came hard across the plains, rattling the shutters. She sat by the window in the main room, the rifle across her lap. The lamplight flickered against the walls, casting long shadows. In the other room, the children slept, but rest did not come for her. She thought of the button, of the girl's mother's words, of the eyes under the black hat. Near midnight, she rose and walked quietly to the children's room. They were all tangled in blankets, the girl's hand resting lightly on the younger boy's arm. She stood there longer than she meant to, listening to the steady rise and fall of their breathing, memorizing it like a prayer. As she turned to go, the girl stirred, opening her eyes without surprise. "He's coming," she whispered, voice steady, as if stating a fact. The widow's breath caught. "How do you know?" The girl's gaze was unblinking in the dim light. "Because he's been looking for us for a long time." The wind rattled the glass, and somewhere outside, a loose shutter banged once, then again, like a warning. The wind picked up as the sun tilted toward the horizon, turning the ridges gold and casting the valley in long, restless shadows. Elara stood by the half-mended corral fence, her palms raw from the day's work. She never held a hammer for more than a minute before coming here, yet now she knew the weight of it better than the weight of a pen. Each nail she drove into the warped boards felt like a small, stubborn claim on this life she hadn't chosen but couldn't yet walk away from. Behind her, the ranch house loomed, its dark windows catching the late light, turning it into molten glints that looked almost watchful. Inside, she could hear Matthew pacing. He was deliberate about it, measured steps, turning sharply at the parlor's end, yet there was a quiet agitation in the rhythm. She noticed it earlier at supper when he barely touched his stew, his jaw tightening whenever their eyes met. That was how she knew he'd read the letter she'd hidden in her bureau. She hadn't meant for him to find it. She wasn't even sure if she meant to send it, but the thought of her old life had been too heavy to keep inside. When the screen door creaked, she braced herself. "You've been working past sundown again," Matthew said, his voice rougher than usual, though not unkind. She kept her gaze on the fence. "It's the only time the air isn't like boiling water. Besides, it keeps me from thinking too much." He came to stand beside her, leaning on the rail she just mended. "Thinking about what?" She considered lying, but the truth pressed against her ribs. "About whether I belong here." The pause that followed wasn't long, but it deepened the silence between them like a wedge. He shifted, resting both hands on the rail. "That letter you wrote." Her stomach dipped. "It didn't sound like someone deciding. It sounded like someone running." She looked at him then, the shadows across his face making him harder to read. "Maybe I was running. Maybe I still am." His eyes narrowed, not in anger but as though he were weighing something fragile. "You think I don't understand that? I've been running for years, Alara. The only difference is I never found somewhere worth stopping for." The words landed heavier than she expected. She turned away, blinking against the prickling in her eyes. "Then why keep me here? Why not let me go before we both regret it?" He exhaled slowly, scanning the empty pasture as though it might answer for him. "Because you don't look like someone who's finished fighting yet. And he broke off, shaking his head. "I don't want to watch another good thing walk out of my life." The truth in his tone unsettled her more than any anger could. She'd thought of him as gruff, pragmatic, maybe even cold. But there it was, an edge of quiet desperation, the kind that doesn't shout but clings. Before she could reply, a shout came from the far ridge. Both their heads snapped toward it. Dust rose in a twisting plume, and through it came a rider, fast, urgent, the horse's hooves throwing up sparks of light where stone met steel shoes. Matthew's posture stiffened. "Stay here," he said, already moving toward the hitching post. But she followed, matching his stride. "If it's bad news, I want to hear it." The rider pulled up hard, the horse lathered and breathing hard. It was the younger ranch hand, Eli, his face pale beneath a mask of dust. "It's the east pasture, fences cut clean through. Couple dozen head gone. Found fresh tracks leading toward the canyon." Matthew's jaw clenched. "Rustlers." Eli nodded. "And there's something else. One of the hands we sent after them didn't come back. We found his horse wandering near the creek. Saddle empty." The air between them turned colder despite the heat. Matthew swung into his saddle. "Get the others armed and ready. We ride in 10. Eli spurred off, leaving the smell of sweat and dust hanging in the air. Alara gripped the hitching post, watching Matthew tighten the reins. "You can't go after them tonight. It'll be dark before you reach the canyon." "I can't wait till morning," he said. "Every hour we lose is another mile between us and the herd." She swallowed hard. "And if they're the kind who don't leave witnesses?" He stilled, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that carried its own warning. "Then I guess I'd better make sure I'm not the one left behind." For a moment she saw it, not just the man standing before her, but the life he'd lived before her arrival. The losses he'd hinted at but never named. The unspoken belief that danger was the only constant he could count on. He started to turn away, but she stepped closer. "Matthew." He stopped. "Don't come back dead," she said quietly. His expression softened, just enough to show he'd heard the plea for what it was. "Not planning to." And then he was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading toward the ridge until the valley was quiet again. Inside, the house felt larger, emptier. She lit a lamp and sat by the window, the glow catching the curve of her hands as she tried to sew. But the needle wavered in her grip, her mind pulled toward the canyon where shadows were already thickening. Every creak of the house felt like a false footstep. Every gust rattling the shutters sounded too much like distant gunfire. By the time the sky went fully dark, she'd abandoned the sewing and taken to pacing. The lamp sputtered, throwing brief, jittery light across the walls. She kept glancing at the clock, though she had no idea what time to expect him back. Hours passed. Then hoofbeats. Faint at first, then closer. She rushed to the door, but when the rider emerged from the darkness, it wasn't Matthew. It was Eli again, slumped in the saddle, his shirt torn and stained. She ran to him. "Where's Matthew?" Eli slid down awkwardly, catching himself against the porch rail. "He sent me ahead. Said," his breath hitched, "said to tell you not to wait up. He's tracking them deeper into the canyon." Her pulse quickened. "Alone?" Eli's gaze dropped, which was answer enough. "He thinks there's more to it than stolen cattle." She felt the boards beneath her feet sway, though she knew it was only her. "What does that mean?" Eli hesitated, as if weighing whether to say it. Finally, he looked up, dust streaking the lines of his young face. "He found something. Said it might have to do with you." The night seemed to still around her, the crickets falling silent. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called, a long, wavering note that seemed to stretch the space between heartbeats. She gripped the porch rail until her knuckles whitened, staring toward the black silhouette of the canyon. The heat of the day was gone, replaced by a cold she felt in her bones. If Matthew was right, the past she tried to outrun wasn't just catching up. It had already found its way here. The wind had a restless edge that morning, carrying the smell of distant rain and the dry tang of dust from the cattle yard. Ruth moved through the small kitchen with a purposeful quiet, her hands steady though her chest felt tight. The house was hushed, save for the ticking of the old wall clock and the low murmur of hoofbeats beyond the window. She glanced outside. He was back earlier than expected. Jacob swung down from his bay mare with a deliberate slowness, his hat pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. Even at this distance, she could sense something weighted in his stance. He came in without a word, the door's hinges sighing. Mud clung to his boots, his coat was flecked with dust, and his jaw worked as though chewing on thoughts too bitter to swallow. Ruth set the coffee pot on the table. "You've been to town," she said, though it wasn't a question. Jacob nodded once, his gaze not meeting hers. "Saw Samuel Hargrove there." The name fell between them like a heavy stone in still water. She felt her spine stiffen. Samuel Hargrove, the man Jacob had spoken of only once, and with the kind of voice a man uses when he'd rather forget. "What did ye want?" Jacob's hand tightened around his cup before he even took a sip. "Didn't say much. Just looked me over. Like a man measuring a fence post before pulling it out of the ground." He finally glanced up, and in his eyes Ruth saw the shadow of old anger. She didn't press further. Instead she poured her own cup, the steam rising between them like a fragile truce. But Jacob wasn't one to sit with words unspoken. "He's been asking questions about the ranch. About you." The spoon in her hand stilled. "Me?" Jacob gave a curt nod. "Don't know why, and I don't like guessing." His voice had that rough, controlled tone that meant he'd been thinking about it all the way home. "Hargrove's a man who deals in trouble. Always has been. Last time I crossed him, it ended in blood." The air in the room felt tighter, and Ruth set her cup down carefully. "You think he's here for revenge? I think men like him don't come sniffing around unless they mean to take something." Jacob leaned back, his chair creaking. "And I won't let him take this place. Or you." Her breath caught at the way he said it, steady, unflinching, but she also knew what it meant. Trouble was no longer a distant possibility, it had found their doorstep. Later, while Jacob went out to check the fence line, Ruth stood on the porch and watched him disappear into the golden sweep of pasture. She'd been here long enough to know the rhythms of the land, the sigh of the grass in the wind, the way the horizon seemed endless yet held every secret of survival. And yet she still felt like a guest in a story that began long before her. Jacob carried scars she'd never seen, both the kind that marked the skin and those that left deeper imprints. By afternoon, clouds were gathering, bruised and low. She busied herself with mending, but her thoughts kept circling back to the man in town. Hargrove. The name had weight, like the threat of a storm before the first lightning flash. She wondered if Jacob's past might be more dangerous than she'd let herself believe. The sound of hoofbeats came again, faster this time. Ruth stepped outside, heart quickening, but it wasn't Jacob. A young ranch hand rode up, breathless. "Ma'am, Mr. Jacob says you're to stay inside and lock the doors." "Now." Her pulse thudded. "Why?" The boy swallowed hard. "Hargrove's not alone. He's got men with him. 5, maybe more. They're riding this way." She didn't remember closing the door, but suddenly she was inside, her hands on the latch, the quiet of the house pressing in. She moved quickly, checking windows, drawing curtains, the way she'd seen women do during storms or when coyotes came too close to the chicken coop. But this felt different. Wilder. Human danger had a scent all its own, metallic, sharp, like blood in the air. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the low rumble of thunder. She stood in the middle of the room, listening, every muscle tense. Then, faint voices carried on the breeze. Men laughing. Not the good kind. The sound crawled up her spine. Through a slit in the curtain, she saw them, riders fanning out near the fence line, their shapes dark against the tall grass. One of them, broad-shouldered, with a coat that gleamed even in the dim light, must have been Hargrove. He turned in the saddle, scanning the house like he was reading it. Her stomach clenched. A shadow moved at the edge of the yard, Jacob, stepping out from behind the barn. He held his rifle loosely, but his stance was coiled, ready. For a moment, time felt suspended, the riders in the distance, the gray clouds above, Jacob's steady figure framed by the storm. Hargrove nudged his horse forward, slow, deliberate. "Afternoon, Jacob!" His voice carried too easily, slick with mockery. "Heard you been keeping something that belongs to me." Ruth's breath caught. She couldn't see Jacob's face from here, but she could feel the tension in him. "You're mistaken," Jacob called back. "Am I?" Hargrove leaned in the saddle. "I ain't here to trade words. I'm here to collect." His gaze slid toward the house, toward her. "And I always collect." Lightning forked in the distance, the thunder closer now. Jacob didn't move. "You'll ride back the way you came, Hargrove. This land, this house, they're mine to protect." A laugh rolled from the riders, but Hargrove's smile thinned. "We'll see about that." He turned his horse slightly, like a man deciding between patience and violence. "Tomorrow. Sundown. You hand over what's mine, or we take it." The riders wheeled away, hooves tearing at the earth, their laughter fading into the wind. Jacob stood there a long moment after they were gone, the storm swelling behind him. When he came inside, he closed the door with deliberate care. Ruth was still near the window, her fingers gripping the curtain. "You hurt," he said. She nodded. "What does he want, Jacob? Truly?" He looked at her then, and she saw something raw in his eyes, something that wasn't fear, but a memory sharpened by it. "He thinks you're someone else. Someone from before." He drew a slow breath. "And I can't tell if it's mistaken identity, or if he's right." The words landed between them like the first heavy drops of rain, carrying the weight of a truth that could change everything.